Hi everyone! We are live on YouTube and Facebook as well as Instagram over here, and today we are talking about show versus tell. It is my favorite subject to talk about, and so I'm hoping that today won't be super long. Um, so throughout this whole thing, if you have any questions about show versus tell, or if anything I say doesn't quite make sense, or you want some clarification or anything, please feel free to leave those in the comments. I would love to interact with you and just kind of answer all your questions because, like I said, this is a massive topic. It's super fun to talk about, my favorite thing to talk about. So if you, again, have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be moderating those and we can talk about those together. But I also have some things to chat about too. So we'll do a little bit of training and then we'll answer any questions. All right, let's get started talking about show versus tell. Okay. So the first thing that we need to answer is, what is show versus tell? I'm glad you asked. Yeah, no one asked. I said that. Okay, so show versus tell is basically showing the reader what is happening in your story instead of telling them. So it kind of comes out in a lot of different ways, and there are different ways to think about it. So we'll chat about that as we go through all of the talking points, a few things that I want to discuss with you just because yeah, we're just going to cover all of that stuff. So it looks differently, but the basic principle of the thing is that you want to show the reader what's happening instead of telling them. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is helpful, but first one is it keeps the reader engaged in the story, which keeps them reading. So it helps the character or the reader to feel like they know the characters, to feel like they are in the middle of all of it. And the more invested they are in the story, the more they're going to keep reading. So there's a lot of things that go into this, like pacing and point of view and things like that. But the basic premise of show versus tell is that it keeps the reader in the story. The other good, helpful thing to remember is that it helps the reader be the judge of what's happening in the story. So there's a lot of stuff around this, but basically when you're looking at something in your story, a certain sentence or a paragraph, a good question to ask yourself is, who is making the judgment here? If you as the writer are making the judgment about what is happening in the story and that comes across on the page, the reader isn't given that chance to do it. So you want to make the reader the judge of what's happening. And there's a lot of ways to do this, and we'll talk about that when we get to some examples. But kind of keep that in the back of your head. Who is making the judgment about what's happening in the story? And there's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it is because the world today is very visual. People are interacting with video all the time, movies, TV shows, and I like to think about my book as I'm writing as a movie. And that's the best way for me to kind of conceptualize it, because in a movie, you're not told what the characters are doing. You actually see it happening. And so that's the way that I like to think about it. If I can't picture what I wrote down on the page, if I can't picture it like it's a movie playing out, then I haven't done my job as a writer. So the reason that the reader needs to be the judge of what's happening in the book is because we as people, as human beings, are making that judgment every day. All the interactions we have, any interaction with the world that we have, any interaction with other people, we're always making judgments. When we have a conversation with someone, we are making judgments about what they're feeling or thinking, whether we do it or whether we mean to do it or not. It's just part of the human experience. So the reader is familiar, and us as humans, all of us, are familiar with that concept of being the judge of what's happening. And if we can engage with someone, if we can engage with that reader and help them make that judgment about what's going on in our book, they're going to feel engaged in it, because that's how we interact with the world. And if we as humans interact with the world because we're judging what's going on in the world and how we interact and the different people and the environment and all of that, then they're going to feel like your book is reality to them. And that's going to help them be more engaged. So that was a long explanation of why the reader gets engaged when you do use show versus tell. But all right, so we're going to move into some examples. I have these written down, so that's why I'm looking over to the side so that I don't forget. Okay, so there's some examples. Now, for everyone who's joined, if you have any questions about show versus tell, anything you want clarification on or want me to expand on or anything like that, please feel free to leave a question. We're going to talk through some examples and some tips on show versus tell, but if you have any questions, always feel free to ask and we'll discuss those. Okay, so let's talk about a few examples. The first one I have is angry. If a character is angry, you don't want to say, this person is angry. Let's be a little more subtle here. Let's engage the reader in the story. So if you say that the character is angry, you are making that judgment as the writer that the character is angry. You are not allowing that reader to kind of guess at what the reader is feeling by seeing what is going on. So as a writer, you are presenting a picture. You're basically creating a picture with your words for the reader, and the reader is making that judgment of what's going on. So instead of saying a character is angry, there are a few different ways you could say this. You could show that their nostrils are flaring. That's a popular one. I use that a lot. Or you could say that they're seething. So it's not only like them showing action, like it's not describing their action. It's also could just be the word that you use as the verb as the action word in the sentence. So could be seething, it could things like that. Instead of just saying they angrily replied, we'll talk about adverbs in a minute, but instead of saying they angrily replied, you could just say they shot back. That's an action type, they bit back. That's another way to kind of say that they were angry or frustrated at something. So that's one to think about, is angry. Another one is resign. So if something's happened, they're just, they give in, they give up, whatever, this is what's going to happen. Sighing is a popular one for that. Also, let's see, what else do I have? Shoulders drooping. So that's also could just be like okay. So basically you are, and I've even heard some writers have a mirror in front of next to their computer. So when they're writing, they can make the facial expression. They can, oh, I'm feeling sad. Okay. So they're frowning. You can see yourself doing those certain things. So it's really helpful to just think about it again, like a movie. Think about the characters on the screen and what you would see, and then write that. All right, let's do some more examples. Embarrassed, cheeks turn red, they hide their eyes, they turn away. Those are always, good indicators that somebody is embarrassed, and it's contextual too. So it's not always clear what the character is exactly feeling. But that's good. That's okay. Because in real life, it's not always clear what a person's actually feeling. So you actually are striving for that, because then the reader makes its judgment, and then they're trying to figure it out. But then if they make the wrong judgment, then maybe later on they realize that, hey, that person was actually embarrassed instead of angry or whatever it was they thought. And then again, it engages them in reality, because that's how we interact with the world. Okay, so sad, they drag their feet, their face falls. We already talked about frowning. Those are all good ways to describe someone as sad. And then scared, their face turns white, their eyes widen. That's one I like to use a lot. And eyes widening can mean a few different things. So that's always a fun one to throw in there, because it could throw the reader off a little bit, which isn't always a bad thing again. All right, so those are some good examples. Another one is like nervous. Usually they hide their eyes or shift their weight, could be one. There's like, for every emotion out there, there is a way to describe it what you're seeing, physically seeing. So anyway, so that's kind of some examples. Let's go through a few tips. We already talked about thinking about it as a movie. So if you want to really engage the reader, picture your book as a movie in your head, and then describe what you would see on the screen, because that's going to be the best way to get the reader to engage in your story, really connect with it, and just, enjoy your book, which is really what you want, right? You want them to keep reading, finish the book, and love it. Cool. And then leave a review, hopefully. Okay, so another tip is to engage all the senses. So show versus tell is really helpful for this. Now, what I've been talking about mostly right now is seeing. What do you see? What would the reader see if they were watching this scene in a movie? Or what do the characters see? But you also want to engage as many other senses as possible. Now, this is usually something that I don't instinctively always do, but I'm getting better at, and then I'll add back in, and I'll add in like during the editing process. But as you need to describe what the characters are smelling, what they are, what they can taste if they're eating something, or even if they're like, the fog is so thick they can almost taste it, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways to engage senses. Smelling is a popular one just because you can really, that's a very strong, something very strong that a person can relate to. Especially if it's a scent that someone's familiar with, or you could, smells like grandma's apple pie or whatever, it kind of evokes certain things. Taste, what did they feel, that kind of thing. So cover the 5 senses, because that's really going to be helpful to engage that reader. Again, I mean, I'm just going to keep saying it. Show versus tell engages the reader. That's the long and short of it. So using all 5 senses can really help with that. Another one is using action verbs, which we talked about a little bit. Instead of saying they walked here or they looked here, instead of saying walked, you could say sauntered, you could say skipped, you could say sprinted, you could say ran, you could say shuffled. I mean, there's so many different ways to describe how a person walks across a room, and it will tell the reader something about their attitude or their personality maybe, or their current mood at the time. So think about when you're looking and when you're editing, or even while you're writing, think about looking for words like looked. That's a really popular one. There are a lot of ways to look at people. You can gaze at them, you can glare at them, you can narrow your eyes, which isn't even an action necessarily. It's not like a way to look. It's a physical, manifestation. But anyway, you get the point. So think about your verbs as you're going along, as you're editing, as you're rereading, whatever it is. Think about all those different verbs and how you can make them more evocative, how you can make them more descriptive. And also, I said we talk about adverbs. So let's talk about adverbs. I know some people are of the persuasion that adverbs are not good. That's kind of true and kind of not. So adverbs are good if they're a certain type of adverb. So you don't necessarily want to use judgment adverbs. I just made that up right now. Anyway, because I was talking about, the reader making judgment. So you don't want to use adverbs like angrily, because you're making a judgment about the emotion the person's feeling. But you could say quickly or suddenly or hurriedly, because it's not so much the judgment about what the character's feeling or anything. It's more about the judgment of what the character is doing. So it's kind of like a time thing, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like they moved quickly across the room. Like, probably move is one of those like not so action verbs that you want to replace. But so stuff like that. Think about your adverbs. Consider what they are doing. Consider if you're making a judgment for the reader or if you're allowing the reader to make a judgment. So adverbs, in my opinion, are not bad, but they should be considered. And last point we're going to make is you want to make your show versus tell, all your descriptions, character specific. So your character they're all different. They've all got different wants, dreams, hopes for the future, plans. They've got different backgrounds and past. They've had past traumas. They have hang-ups. They've got all kinds of things that make them a person. So, little caveat, knowing your character helps with this. And I'm always a big fan and advocate of knowing your character really, really well, because they're going to drive the story for you. But when you're considering show versus tell, make it character specific. So sometimes a character would avert their eyes when they are embarrassed, but another person might actually act out, for lack of a better term, and start yelling or be inordinately loud when they don't need to be, depending on their personality. So it's going to depend on the character, their personality, their current attitude, the way that they interact with the world, and the way they engage. So consider all of those things when you're talking about show versus tell. Now, that is a lot, and there's still a lot more that I could talk about. So I did a show versus tell masterclass back last year, and I do have the replay up on my website. It is linked on Facebook and YouTube, and it's a link in my bio on Instagram. So if you're interested for more information on show versus tell, you can check that out. But hopefully that was a good overview of what show versus tell is, give you some examples, and kind of so you can figure out how to incorporate it into your writing life. All right. Well, thank you so much. We will be back next Tuesday. If you have any questions for me, always feel free to reach out. I'd love to chat with you, and we will talk soon. All right. Bye. Bye. See you guys later.